To Pete Daniel, who represents the best in public history, he's devoted himself to historical research, publication, exhibition, education, and professional service. Pete was the first public historian elected president of the Organization of American Historians. He's also served as president of the Southern Historical Association, the Agricultural History Society, and the Society for History in the Federal Government. The Smithsonian Institution held a research conference in his name in 2006. He received awards from all the major historical associations, including the Pogue Award from the Oral History in the Middle Atlantic region. Pete, congratulations.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark. The Roger R. Trask Award is a high honor and a reminder of friendships and causes over some 3 decades. I considered a number of topics for today, but one way or another, they all circle back to my search for historical understanding. The search has been conducted across a broad spectrum of institutions and has allowed me to work with brilliant people and some not so brilliant. Over my career, I've had a foot in the academic world. 3 years at UNC Wilmington, 6 years in exile at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, a year at UMass Boston, and another year at Emory University. And in public history, 2 years as an aide to a U.S. senator, and 27 years at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. I was tempted to vent on these disparate cultures, but I would undoubtedly have offended friends on both sides of the aisle. Today, with some exceptions, most academicians hold public historians in high regard. Indeed, increasingly, they point their students our way, realizing that our work, our pay, and our feeling of accomplishment rival, if not surpass, the academy. Before settling into a discussion of historical research, I want to mention my 2 years working as an aide to Senator Robert B. Morgan from North Carolina. The Hill experience proved invaluable in honing my skepticism, and Congress's recent history has sharpened it to a point. You are all familiar, I'm sure, that Senator Morgan introduced the first Archives Independence Bill and of the role that archivists and other federal historians played in winning independence for the National Archives. Federal historians also drafted guidelines for maintaining the scholarly integrity of museum exhibits that proved invaluable in confronting the Smithsonian's leadership and its eagerness to turn exhibits over to sponsors that would pretty much turn into a trade show. I also learned the insecurity of Hill employment. I took leave from the University of Tennessee in 1978, thanks to an NEH fellowship, packed all my belongings in a U-Haul, and moved to Washington. I took a leave for tax purposes. I never intended to go back to Knoxville. I spent the year at the Archives doing research on Southern farmers. Meanwhile, I was promoted to full professor. When I took the job with Senator Morgan, I resigned my position at the University of Tennessee. Then, in November of 1980, Senator Morgan lost his seat in the Reagan landslide, and I was unemployed. I hold the record for the quickest descent from full professor to unemployed. The search for historical understanding would be futile without archivists, and I could talk all day about the kindness of archivists and their essential role in enabling historians to find documentation. Even after Doug Helms had left his job at the National Archives, he pointed me to important files I would never have discovered otherwise. Jimmy Rush then took me over and eventually passed me to Joe Schwartz. In my many tours of the South, archivists have gone out of their way to help me find documentation. My talk about research, then, is also about archivists who made it possible. My search for historical understanding has taken U-turns, hit dead ends, occasionally sped along the interstate, but most often just went steadily through archives. Research, analysis, and writing have often led to conclusions that contest notions of progress that are so deeply ingrained in the public consciousness. How I became a purveyor of unhappy endings, as friends and critics often remind me, is inexplicable given my regular attendance at B-Westerns in my youth, which invariably ended up with the hero riding off into the sunset, villains jailed or shot dead. Gene Autry and Roy Rogers shared with Superman and Batman the notion that good defeats evil. My historical work, on the other hand, has not treated celebratory history well. When I first began as a historian, I hoped primarily to get the facts in order, spell the names correctly, and place commas appropriately. But increasingly, I was intrigued with understanding how the parts fit together and how the players move through space and time. Finding documents is only the first step, for they demand skepticism and analysis. When working on my MA degree at Wake Forest University, Professor David L. Smiley offered this advice: with newspaper stories, you know the reporter's lying. You need to figure out why he used those particular words to tell his lies. It has been my experience that a historian must extend this skepticism to all sources. I'm at a loss to explain my methodology, driven as it is by hints, hunches, frustration, and luck. In 1968, when searching for a dissertation topic, I was reading the NAACP's Crisis magazine on the 5th floor of what is now the Library of Congress's Adams Building, and came across an article on peonage, of which I knew nothing. Curious, I went 2 floors down to the manuscript room and found 2 boxes containing material on peonage in the NAACP papers. Since most of the correspondence there was with the Justice Department, my next step was at the National Archives, where Donald Moshholder, a quiet-spoken and keen archivist, assured me that there were substantial peonage records. The first boxes he sent to the search room contained letters from barely literate people complaining of being forcibly held to work out debts, U.S. attorney summaries of special agent reports on involuntary servitude, and case files that seldom indicated successful prosecution. With just this glimpse, I had a warm feeling that this was my topic. I spent over a half year buried in those records and searched for additional documentation throughout the South and part of the North. This was the first time that I recall having a topic invade my consciousness and come to life. When I discovered a significant Supreme Court case involving peonage, I went to the law library at the Library of Congress. I still recall approaching a staff person with a citation to this Supreme Court case and asking where I might find the volume. At that time, the law library was in the Jefferson Building and the staff desk elevated. This stern man looked at my citation, grimaced, looked over my head, and told me to turn around and go to the shelf marked U.S. Reports, find volume 211, turn to page 455, and I would find my case. With a sense of mortification mixed with excitement, I found my case, which was full of footnotes to other relevant cases. With the same citation, I learned I could call up briefs and records for that case. It turned out that involuntary servitude, peonage, had a complex legal history that was documented by sources in Justice Department records, dozens of federal district cases, and a half-dozen Supreme Court cases. Intrigued by a murder case in Georgia dealing with peonage, I wrote to the clerk in Newton County, Georgia, asking if there were a transcript. After a lull of 6 months, he replied that there were 3 trial transcripts and I could drop by any time it was convenient. I humbly asked if they could be Xeroxed and mailed. With peonage, the poorest and most vulnerable people, sharecroppers, wage hands, and immigrants, were enslaved by what to most appearances were respectable folks who corrupted law enforcement officials to do their bidding. No cowboy hero rode into these southern communities to set things right. When I completed revisions to my dissertation, I submitted it to a publisher. It was rejected. I was told it was rejected because my last chapter insisted that involuntary servitude continued after World War II. Of course it did. During World War II, there were 2 Supreme Court cases. I also had friends at the Justice Department at that time who were smuggling me out documentation. And indeed, in 1988, 16 years after The Shadow of Slavery was published, there was another Supreme Court case. I revised my manuscript, found more documentation, and the ending turned out even less happy than the first draft. After this experience, I became suspicious of book publishers and their desire to change history to sell books. Beware publishers. This experience served me well in museum work, where funders pressured us to tilt exhibits with success stories.